Welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast.
Hi there, how are you all? Welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast, which is brought to you by the mighty Kraken, the best place to buy, sell, and trade Bitcoin. I'm your host, Peter McCormack, and today I've got part 3 of my Bitcoin Beginner's Guide. I have an interview with Aaron van Wirdum, technical editor at Bitcoin Magazine, and we're going to discuss the precursors to Bitcoin and the Cypherpunk movement. But before that, I do have a message from my amazing show sponsors. So first up today, it's BlockFi, the future of Bitcoin and financial services, and what an amazing year they had last year. And I know that they are going to crush it this year, and there's no better place to kick this off than what they announced with their plans for 2020. I really cannot wait for this. BlockFi are going to be launching a BTC rewards credit card. Yes, you're going to be able to earn Bitcoin cashback rewards from your credit card. Amazing. Can't wait to get this. Can't wait to try it out. They've also got a mobile app coming, and they've just announced support for USDC and Litecoin. And this is on top of their market-leading products. They have the best crypto-backed loans product in the market, and they also have the best interest accounts in the market for your Bitcoin, Ether, and GUSD. I'm a customer, and I love getting my interest every month. I do love these interest accounts. 2020 is going to be massive for BlockFi. So if you're interested in checking them out, I recommend you do your own research, then head over to blockfi.com, which is blockfi.com. And next up, we have the mighty Kraken. You know Kraken. You know they're the best place to buy, sell, and trade Bitcoin. But why? I bang on about this the whole time. Why do I use them? Well, firstly, they've got the most secure exchange in the market. They put safeguarding of your funds and your privacy as their number one objective. If you never heard my show with Nick Picocco, their chief security officer, go back and check it out. It was a monster. Also, they have an additional layer of near real-time, hyper-personalized support through Kraken account management. And if you're a trader, come on, why would you trade anywhere else? They've got so many products. Their suite of products is second to none. They've got Kraken.com, the best place to trade Bitcoin. You can supercharge your trades with up to 5x leverage. You've got access to up to the second pricing data with cryptocurrency indices powered by CF benchmarks. They've got next level trading with Bitcoin futures. Their OTC desk offers deeper liquidity, and they've got more private and personalized service. They've also got Crypto Watch, where you can access markets across multiple exchanges at a glance. And at the end of last year, they launched Kraken Pro, a badass, beautiful mobile-first app so you can trade Kraken wherever you are. There is no better place to trade Bitcoin. Find out more at kraken.com or download the app, which is available for the iPhone and Android. Just search for Kraken Pro, which is Kraken Pro. Okay, on to part 3 of my Bitcoin Beginner's Guide, and I couldn't wait to make this one. I really, really love this subject. So following the first 2 episodes where we looked at why we need Bitcoin and then what money is, and before we dive into what Bitcoin is itself and how it works, we're going to take a look at the digital money projects which led to Bitcoin and the cypherpunk movement which dominated them. For this, I'm very, very lucky to have Aaron van Wirdum on the show, who's the technical editor at Bitcoin Magazine, and he was also the author of the Genesis Files, a series of articles exploring these projects, which also helped me prep for this interview. So Bitcoin was not the first attempt at digital money. In fact, there have been a number of attempts and proposals from the likes of David Chaum's eCash to Wei Dai's B-Money, Nick Szabo's BitGold to Adam Back's Hashcash. While there are many other important parts of history, these are some of the key projects which will help you understand how Bitcoin came to be. They are the building blocks. They are the pieces of the puzzle which Satoshi Nakamoto used to create Bitcoin along with his own innovations. So in this show, we're going to get into the merits of these projects and proposals, what worked, what didn't, what the innovations were, and how they fit into Bitcoin. And we talk about the cypherpunk movement and the people who were involved in that and what they stood for and what they wanted to achieve. It's a really awesome show. I hope you enjoy it as much as I hope making it. If you've got any questions, feel free to hit me up. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. Aaron, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Thank you for doing this at last minute. So I've been doing this beginner's guide to Bitcoin. I've been wanting to put together this resource for people whereby if they're new to Bitcoin and they want to learn as much as they can as quickly as possible. It's a series of interviews that takes them through all the things that they will kind of want to learn as quickly as possible. So I've done 2 shows already. The first one I did was with Andreas, where we covered why we need Bitcoin, so people understand why it's important. The second one I did was with Parker Lewis talking about money, so people understand money, how they think about money. Because I know myself before Bitcoin, I hadn't thought about money. Hopefully, after those two interviews, people will have an interest in Bitcoin. What I think next is a good point is to talk to them about like the precursors to Bitcoin, why they did it, what went right, what went wrong, and so they can understand it before we talk about Bitcoin. And there's no better person to do that with than you, because your Genesis files were fantastic. So this is what we're going to do today.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I will add, I don't consider myself necessarily the top expert on any of these particular topics, because for any of these particular topics, the top expert would be, Nick Szabo for his work. You interviewed him. But I think I hope I can give you kind of a nice bird's eye view of like the whole process and the step-by-step iteration of how we got to Bitcoin.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think Nick would be great, but I think yourself as a journalist comes at it a different way. So I would have preferred to do that. Well, I'm doing it with you, which is great. So during your Genesis files, you kind of identified 4 key projects, but also I've dropped in there into the narrative the part of the cypherpunks.
Sure.
So we'll work through it all, but essentially there is a history of people who have tried to create a new form of money.
Yeah, I would note actually the Genesis Files articles. In a way, I kind of see it as like series 1. I've always wanted to do a series 2 because there's some projects that are worth covering that I haven't yet, like Arpao, which was Helvini's thing, and Eagold. But I do think that the 4 that I did cover maybe give the best sort of linear progression towards Bitcoin in a way.
Yeah, and it was funny because I've read your articles before. I've read all 4 of them, but I've never read them all together in one go like I did in prepping for this. And what becomes very clear is this journey to Bitcoin. This,
Yeah.
All the things that were tried, all the things that happened that led up to why Bitcoin worked. Because without it, you can dive into the world of Bitcoin and it's really complicated. But there were a number of things that had to have happened to make Bitcoin itself happen.
Yeah, it definitely didn't come out of nothing, which, some people may still think like there was nothing and then there all of a sudden this Satoshi demigod created Bitcoin and there it was. No, yeah, it was more of a step-by-step process. And if you see all the steps, then you also see that Satoshi, he didn't invent anything particularly new. He just put it together in a very clever way. A very clever way. I mean, all credit to him. I don't want to take anything away from that. Like it was genius, but it like all of the pieces of the puzzle were there.
Yeah, it was a jigsaw puzzle he pulled together, and he rightly thanks and cites those people who influenced the work in the white paper for Bitcoin.
Some of them.
Well, yeah. Well, so interestingly, I don't know if you noticed when my interview with Szabo, I actually asked him if he was a bit pissed that he wasn't cited in the white paper, and that was a cool response he gave. But one of the interesting parts for me is that I thought the cypherpunks were around before eCash and the DigiCash project by David Chang. It was when I was going through this, I actually realized, no, David Chang predates all of this. He really saw what was coming with the internet and saw what was, the importance of privacy. And this is a quote I'd actually read a few times before, but I'm going to start with this quote because I think it's really important. But he said, "Everything you do could be known to anyone else, could be recorded forever. It's antithetical to the basic principle underlying the mechanics of democracy." Great quote.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think privacy is such an important thing just for society in general. Without it, this is one of the things he foresaw, is that the internet, if we're not careful, could become this huge panopticon, right? Where everyone could be watched at any potential time. You're not sure if you're actually being watched, but just the potential alone is scary, and it would influence behavior. It would disincentivize dissidents or critical journalism even, and all of that. If you have no privacy, you just behave differently. And with something digital like in the internet, it's not even the current powers that be that you might be scared of, but you don't know who's going to be in power in 10 years. And if all of your personal data, including like transaction data, if it's all stored, you don't know who's going to be very unhappy with you 10 years from now.
And you know what? We look at the internet right now. We look at everything that's happened over the last, say, decade. Everything that's happened with Edward Snowden, for example. All
Yeah.
the issues we have with censorship online. And he was talking about this at the CERN conference in Geneva in '94. He saw all of this coming.
Cham did, yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's like the whole world was kind of asleep for decades, while people like David Chaum and Cypherpunks, they were ringing the alarm bell, and no one was listening. And only recently has this become kind of part of the public consciousness that the internet is actually a big risk for privacy and therefore for freedom. Yeah, I do like to think that even though we've kind of dwelled in the completely wrong direction, I do like to think that some of these guys at least kind of carved out a safe space that's there today. Even though the internet did become kind of a panopticon, at least we have something like Tor. It's there if you really need it, and that's something Snowden used, for example, to contact Greenwald, and so even though it the internet is not private in general, there's still these safe spaces, and a lot of the guys we'll talk about did help establish that, did help safeguard that.
Well, I would say right now, there is definitely a movement of people who are understanding, the importance of privacy, the importance of money which isn't controlled by the state. We have people working on this now. We have an opportunity. So, would never say it's too late, but I would say that there's definitely a movement now. I feel it. I mean, you and I will feel it as much as more than most people because we work in the Bitcoin world. So this is all people are talking about. But I think there's a number of interesting projects, and then there is a real movement to fight against this. So I'm positive. But so let's start with David Chaum, because like a lot of people listening to this might not have heard of him. It might even be Bitcoiners who haven't heard of him. I've met David.
Well, he's kind of back in the cryptocurrency space now, isn't he?
Well, he is, yeah.
He came back since I wrote that article. I mean, I'm not suggesting any causation there, but I'm sure there's no causation there. But
yeah, I've met him a couple of times. I think he's a really interesting guy. But for people who don't know who David Chaum is, like, quick background to him.
Now, maybe we should take one small step back even before David Chaum. Is that public key cryptography was invented in 1976 by Diffie and Hellman. Before
I interviewed
you
Diffie.
interviewed him as well. Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
So just for context, before 1976, encryption wasn't a thing that the public could use at all. It was something for secret agencies, and that was the domain. They were encrypting their data, but no one else really was. And in general, or without exception, I would say they used, what's it called? There's a term for it that's slipping my mind. The decryption key would always be the same key as the encryption key. So the only way to communicate securely would be to meet up physically first and exchange keys, and only then could you communicate securely. So that changed with public key cryptography, which for the first time allowed people to communicate securely even though they'd never met, because there's this public key they could share with each other and use to encrypt their communication with one another. So that was invented in 1976. And then David Chaum, only a couple of years later, in 1980, he figured out how to use these kinds of tools for money. So it was invented for communication, basically, and also for signatures, to prove that you could sign data, for example, signifying that you agree with the content, much like an actual signature. And then a couple of years later, David Chaum came up with this concept called blind signatures, and that really enabled the first cryptographic money. So it was the first type of digital something that could act as money, really.
And why was encryption important for money?
I mean, so privacy was his motivation, right?
Uh-huh.
He was all about privacy. He was not a big libertarian. He wasn't schooled in like Austrian economics. That wasn't his motivation. He just wanted to safeguard that what we already have, namely cash, something you can use to a bearer asset which you can use to pay without anyone in the world needing to know that you made that payment. It's just between the payer and the payee. He wanted to create something like that for the internet. He envisioned that the internet was going to be a big thing. This was also in a time where it wasn't clear. The internet kind of evolved into this. The revenue model that dominates the internet today is advertising, right? Like everything on the internet feels free, but that's because you're being served ads or something like that. And back in these days, that wasn't obvious that was going to happen. Some people thought it would be payment, so you'd pay to visit a website, you'd pay to, watch a video. And he saw this potential. He knew that the internet was going to be big, and to avoid tyranny, we'd need a private form of money. He even called his paper in his paper. He even referred to Big Brother, how to prevent Big Brother or something was like the subtitle of that paper.
So with his design for eCash, he ended up building DigiCash, which was his first project, right? And so how was DigiCash structured?
DigiCash was based in Amsterdam. He founded the company around this idea that the Dutch government wanted to implement some sort of toll booth system where, if you drive a car over certain roads, you'd have to pay. And he thought that should be anonymous. Like, the government doesn't need to know where you're driving your car all the time. So that was kind of his pitch to the government. He proposed like a government agency. I think it was it doesn't matter the name of the specific agency, but he made his pitch that I think I can make this anonymous for you. At first they didn't believe it. Then he riled up some friends from Eindhoven University, I believe, and they got together and they built this system in like a week as a proof of concept. This convinced the government agency, and then he founded this company around that. And within this company, he wanted to do more. He wanted to also create eCash.
Yeah. So, but as you said, the idea here wasn't like Bitcoin to have censorship resistance. It wasn't the idea wasn't to be decentralized. This was more about privacy. So this was like the first steps for privacy, but its ultimate downfall that it was centralized.
Well, I mean, I don't know if that was the ultimate downfall, but it's important to note that he wasn't necessarily trying to create a new currency. His system was built for banks. Like, it was just regular, dollars, euros, just existing banks could use this system. So he wasn't trying to reinvent money in the way that something like Bitcoin does. He wanted to provide a layer for anonymous payments on the existing monetary infrastructure.
But it was ultimately inspiration for people within the cypherpunk movement to create some. Did he inspire the creation of the cypherpunks?
I would say he was a big influence. Yes, for sure. Yeah, that's for sure. Even though he didn't really like the cypherpunks himself, and down the road the cypherpunks weren't really in love with him either anymore. They didn't really get along too well, but yeah, he was definitely a big inspiration. Definitely also the cash aspect of it, of course.
And it's quite important to note that both Nick Szabo and Zuko worked with him, Zuko Wilcox.
Yeah, and a bunch of other cypherpunks as well. I think maybe Eric Hughes as well. I'm going from memory here. I could be wrong, but yeah, it was like for the cypherpunks, it kind of became this almost internship thing where a lot of them kind of went there and worked at DigiCash for a little while and sort of learned the ropes.
So the bit where it really gets interesting is after this with the creation of the cypherpunks. So I think it would be really good to just explain who the cypherpunks were, how they came to be, and what were their goals and principles.
Yeah, so maybe it's cool to take a small step back before we get to cypherpunks, because there was another group, and they're not as often discussed within sort of the cryptocurrency ecosystem today, but they were like, have you heard of the extropians?
No, I haven't. There's a lesson for me then.
Yeah, so the extropians, that was they started in the 80s. They were a group of California-based super optimistic futurists, basically, and they got interested in like nanotechnology, life extension technology, space exploration. Like also, like they saw science progressing and then at an increasing exponential pace, even, and they kind of started to philosophize and think about where that could lead society, and that led to very futuristic ideas, including eternal life is a big one. Like they believed that it was very possible that even within their own lifespans, and some of them are still alive today, so who knows, science would progress to the point where we'd cure all diseases as well as old age, right? So we could live forever. That was like one of the key goals they had, but also, like I mentioned, or artificial intelligence and mind uploading that I mentioned. That one, all sorts of these crazy, or I don't know if they're crazy. They didn't think they were crazy for sure. They were taking it very seriously. And one of the interesting things about them, a lot of futuristic ideas around that era, they kind of foresaw the future as managed by some sort of super wise, perfect governments kind of thing. Something like Star Trek comes to mind when I think of that. Like there's perfect government that will, make humanity happy, and these extropians had a very different idea of how humanity should progress, and it was a very libertarian idea, and it was very influenced by Austrian economics, and they saw government as like a roadblock to that future, right? So they got interested in digital cash as well, as from an Austrian perspective as well, and also from the privacy perspective. You can't have a tyrannical government watching over all your transactions, and also realize a utopian future, right? So these guys were thinking about digital cash, and a lot of them. Okay, so next step is, I think Eric Hughes, he moved back to California, or he was looking to relocate in California or something like that. I think he wanted to live closer to the beach. If I think that was it. And then he met up with Tim May because he lived somewhere close to the beach. I was like an old friend of him. And Tim May, he was one of these extropians. So he was thinking about digital cash, and he was thinking of digital cash in the context of information markets, which is an interesting topic if you want to get into that. But Eric Hughes and Tim May, they started talking. They started talking about digital cash, the future of the internet, and then they basically, it was like a meeting of the mind kind of thing, where they just kept talking about this stuff for days and days. And then at some point, they got the idea that they should form a group to protect privacy, to actually make this work, to use the tools of cryptography that were available, and to start building stuff that was useful. So John Gilmore was also one of the three, I guess, unofficial founders of the Cypherpunks. So they met up, they invited a bunch of friends, and a lot of these friends were also extropians. So there's a lot of overlap. So Nick Szabo was in the extropian group. Vaidai was in the extropian group. Helvini was there. Like a lot of these extropians kind of came to this cypherpunk meeting, which wasn't called the cypherpunks yet. The cypherpunks was kind of a joke they came up with. That one of these meetings was like a play on cyberpunk, of course. And they started meeting, and they started discussing how to realize this stuff. So how to realize anonymous remailers, which are sort of the precursors to Tor, digital cash, information markets, how to ensure that the future of humanity would enjoy some level of freedom through encryption.
It's really interesting. Through all of this, though, there are consistent threads. And the consistent threads are privacy, money, anonymity, and censorship. It's a consistent thread that I found through everything I've read and everything I researched for this.
Yeah, in a way, there were actually sort of two schools of thought within the cypherpunks, which is maybe interesting to note. So one school of thought, which was more the Eric Hughes kind of guy, kind of school of thought, and that also is closer to David Chaum, for example. They wanted to safeguard privacy. Like privacy was the thing they cared about for the reasons we just discussed. Like to maintain a healthy level of society, to also be beneficial to democracy, and that was sort of their way of looking at this. And then you had the other school of thought, which was Tim May, was like the main proponent of this, was the crypto anarchist, the crypto anarchist vision of the future, which wasn't just protecting privacy, but it was actually making government obsolete through privacy. Like if your money is private enough, the government can't tax your money. If if your property and more of it would become digital, then you can protect that through encryption, through cryptography, and it would render governments obsolete. So that's sort of the two visions that sort of cooperated within the cypherpunks, even though they weren't all necessarily on the Tim May school of thought there.
Yeah, and I have the quote, "Privacy is necessary for an open society in the electronic age. We cannot expect governments, corporations, or other large, faceless organizations to grant us privacy. We must defend our own privacy if we expect to have any. Cypherpunks write code. We know that someone has to write software to defend privacy, and we're going to write it."
Yeah, that's Eric Hughes, right? That's the
Yeah.
Cypherpunk Manifesto. Well,
Yeah.
I should say, I think it was called a Cypherpunks Manifesto, and there's actually a reason for that, because the cypherpunks didn't see themselves as like a organized, like it wasn't an institution, right? It was like a loose collective of individuals, and they were all free to do whatever they want. They just found each other voluntarily in their goals. This is something also Tim May, for example, he really rejected this idea that the cypherpunks should organize themselves or should lobby governments. He saw the cypherpunks as kind of like the Black Panthers equivalent of the civil rights movement. Like the civil rights movement had its more organized parts of it, and then there were sort of the more radical, unorganized, activists, and that's really how you should see the cypherpunks. I think they were like the unorganized activists that were there to make sure it happened without having to, let the lobbying to the Electronic Frontier Foundation and like these guys. They weren't opposed to them, just the cypherpunks were like radicals and individuals.
And they would submit proposals into the mailing list of what they were working on, get feedback, get ideas, and build and test these things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they met. They had physical meetings as well, where they discussed these kind of stuff. And yeah, but at some point, I think the mailing list became probably the most important center of discussion. And at some point, I think there were like 1,000 people on there from all across the world. Yeah, discussing how to realize privacy, how to realize digital cash, how to make it happen, and write code.
Do you know what the status is of the cypherpunk kind of movement at the moment? Because it's not as it was.
I mean, the mailing list definitely died down. Yeah, I think as a movement it died, but their ideas didn't die, right? I think that's the right way to look at it. At some point, the mailing list, I think by the late 90s, maybe there were still some serious contributions in like the year 2000 or something, but around that time it got spammed and it got noisy and it got hard to read, and which was in part because they had a pretty strict non-moderation policy, which was in the philosophy of the cypherpunks themselves. They didn't want to have anyone in charge, so there was no moderation. Well, that worked while they were small, but at some point it just kind of got overrun by noise, and so the ideas live on, I would say, but as a movement, I guess some people still call themselves cypherpunks nowadays, but
they do, yeah. I mean, you see it in their Twitter handles.
Yeah, I guess there's nothing wrong with that if you look at the original idea that it's individuals doing whatever they want as long as they sort of embrace that ethos. But yeah, the mailing list definitely died, and I'm sure the meetings died long before that. So yeah.
And the number of very well-known people in it, I mean, a lot of them we will know as being people in Bitcoin, but I mean, probably the most famous name in it that other people know would be Julian Assange.
Yeah. I think Elon Musk may have been on there as well. I
really?
saw. I think so. I saw an email from like X.com at some point, and I think it was also on the topic of digital cash. So X.com was his first website, right?
Yeah.
Which kind of merged in PayPal.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think he was on there. Yeah, a lot of the current Bitcoin sort of OGs were on there.
And they had some very significant achievements. When you look back at all the work they did, it's like very significant things. PGP came out of it. You could argue WikiLeaks came out of it, and Bitcoin itself. I mean, these are genuinely things that are known and used globally now.
Yeah, and I would add Tor to that list.
Yeah. So Tor wasn't a CIA invention.
Well, let's just say the technology that Tor ended up using that definitely was sort of brewing there on the Cypherpunk mailing list with remailers and it's sort of similar tech.
Next up, I talked to Aaron more about the cypherpunks and the prehistory of Bitcoin. But before that, I have a message from my amazing sponsors. So first up, I need to welcome my new sponsor, Kelman Law, or Kelman.law, one of the oldest names in Bitcoin and fintech, and one of the premier law firms in the space. Kelman Law is run by Bitcoin OGs based out in New York, and unlike any of the other crypto lawyers you find online, these guys really understand Bitcoin and fintech. They were already operating in the space back in 2013 because they are committed to the cause of Bitcoin and what it means for the world. And of course, most importantly, they accept Bitcoin as payment. So if you're going to have a Bitcoin lawyer, Kelman Law are the guys you need to turn to. One of their partners, Zachary Kelman, is known for drafting a bill submitted to the US Congress in 2014 aimed at exempting on-chain Bitcoin transaction from US regulations. You might know the name of the other founding partner, his brother, Daniel Kelman. He was on my show as part of the Mt. Gox series, helping me understand some of the complexities around civil rehabilitation. And definitely go and check that show out. The Kelman Law team is staffed with lawyers with expertise in litigation, dispute resolution, anti-money laundering, and US and international corporate structuring for fintech businesses or companies or individuals operating within the Bitcoin space. So listen, if you operate a fintech business, or if you have a dispute with someone involved in Bitcoin, maybe someone owes you some Bitcoin, or you just need legal advice related to Bitcoin or fintech, open up your email and send a message to info@kelman.law. That's KELMAN.law. Kelman with one L, not two. Alternatively, go to their website, which is www.kelman.law. And last up, and not least, it's never least, it's Dropbit, my absolute favorite Bitcoin wallet. Hopefully I'm going to be meeting up with them soon, probably at Consensus. We'll all be at Consensus, right? Going to be finding out more about how their plans are going for 2020. I know what's coming. They've got so much cool innovation coming. And after last year, what more would you expect? You know, when I started working with them, they were like, we are the Venmo for Bitcoin. We make it easy to send and receive Bitcoin. And they were right. It was very cool how they had this feature. You could text people Bitcoin. But since then, they've smashed it. They've added the ability to tweet Bitcoin to people. They've added Lightning support with some amazing UX. They've added Betch32 support. They've added the ability to buy Bitcoin in the app. They have crushed it. So if you haven't got it, come on. What are you doing? Why haven't you checked out Dropbit yet? It's available for the iPhone and Android. Just head over to dropbit.app, which is dropbit.app. So out of this, though, one of the very prominent Cypherpunk members is somebody called Adam Back, someone we both know. He's been on my show. I know you know him well. And a very prominent person in Bitcoin, cited in the white paper for his work on Hashcash. So Let's talk about Hashcash, what it is, and then we can talk about why it's so important for Bitcoin.
Yeah, so sort of midway through the 90s, spam became a problem, right? Spam email. You even see that on the Cypherpunk mailing list. Actually, if you sort of dig through the archives, you see like just nonsense, increase your penis types of emails because they didn't have any moderation. Like it became a real problem. It also became a problem for the remailers, which I mentioned. Like they were being spammed, so they were taking up resources for no good reason. So there needed to be a solution for that. And the cypherpunks started to discuss the problem and how to solve it. Now, one way to solve it, of course, is to get government involved, to just make spam illegal and try to, track down the spammers and throw them in jail or fine them or something like that. But cypherpunks and Adam Back in particular, he didn't like that idea at all. He saw that as the beginning of the end of the free internet. If you get government involved in that way, it could lead to the equivalent of like a internet driving license where you're only allowed to use it if you have government approval. So just the idea of getting government involved to stop this kind of stuff was, cypherpunks wanted a different solution. Adam Back in particular, he wanted a different solution. Now, of course, one solution that people discussed in this context was to use something like eCash. Right, that could have worked. Or, you could have used eCash to buy some sort of digital stamps, or like that could have worked. But eCash wasn't really getting off the ground at this point. Like banks weren't really pushing it. There was a kind of the chicken and egg problem of it's only useful to have eCash if you can spend it somewhere. So if merchants will actually accept it, and merchants will only accept it if people are willing to spend it. So if there's people that have eCash, so it was kind of a chicken and egg problem that eCash wasn't able to overcome. Maybe also because of some of Chang's decisions in how he managed the company. He's been getting some flack for that. I mean, he thinks that's nonsense, but who knows? Different people, different opinions. But bottom line is, eCash didn't really get off the ground. So then Adam Back came up with a different solution called Hashcash. So the idea behind Hashcash is, if you'd want to send someone an email, you'd have to actually take some parameters of that email, like the recipient address, and I don't know, maybe the time you send it. I'm not sure what was included. Doesn't really matter. The point is that you had to hash these parameters, and since the outcome of a hash is random, right? So you have to invest some computing cycles to get this random hash, and then only some hashes would be considered valid. So, for example, a hash would have to start with a specific number of zeros. So, if you wanted to send someone an email and that person would only accept emails that included Hashcash, then you'd have to invest some computing cycles. You'd have to invest some computing power in order to get a valid piece of Hashcash, a valid stamp in a way. Now, this would cost you a little bit of energy and therefore, a minuscule amount of money, which is fine if you're sending someone an email. You're not really going to care about a fraction of a cent. But if you're a spammer and you're only profitable if you send the same spam email to 10 million people, then you have to make these computations 10 million times, and then it becomes unprofitable. So it was to disincentivize spam, and in that sense, it could have worked, but it never really caught on either.
Yeah, a very small amount of traction, but ultimately it proved to be a very important development for Bitcoin.
It introduced something new. It introduced this idea that you can tie real world resources to something digital, basically a number which you can then email or which you can just send over the internet, something digital. Well, if we want to get very technically specific, maybe the better way to think about it is, even copying a file, just making a copy of a file costs a little bit of energy. So if you make 1 million copies of a file, that costs a bunch of energy to do it. But then if someone wants to verify that you actually made 1 million copies of the same file, that would cost as much energy as actually making the copies themselves. While Hashcash had this very clever property that it would cost a bunch of energy to create, and then it cost almost no energy to validate that you actually did create it. So hard to produce, easy to verify. That was really the innovation in a way.
Yeah, and the best analogy for me, for somebody new coming in and wants to really understand it, is just to do the reference to gold mining. If you want to mine gold, you have to invest in a bunch of equipment and a bunch of people, and wherever that gold is, you have to mine it. Whether it's at the bottom of an ocean or in the ground, you have to invest a whole bunch of energy and work and cost to mine that gold for you to then sell on. The analogy for Bitcoin being is that if you want to mine Bitcoins for the creation of new Bitcoins, you then have to do something similar. You have to invest a bunch of resources and money to mine that Bitcoin. And that's how Bitcoin has value, because it costs money to create. Is that a fair analogy for someone new?
Yeah, well, I would say Bitcoin takes another step, because the proof of work, these proofs, are themselves kind of the money, right? Mm-hmm. While with Bitcoin, it's just a way of creating money. It's not the proofs themselves you use. Yes. So Bitcoin kind of took another abstraction, which was very clever. But this idea of using the proofs themselves was subsequently used as an idea for other cash systems. So these came before Bitcoin.
Yeah. So after Hashcash, at a very similar time, about a month apart, we had both B Money, which came from Waydai, and we also had BitGold from Nick Szabo. But let's cover B Money first, because you think BitGold is more like Bitcoin, so it's like a logical step.
Yeah, I would say so. BitGold is almost Bitcoin, and B Money is slightly different, yeah.
Okay, so Waydai, a mysterious person, never met him, don't see much of him or hear much of him. What do we know about him?
Very little. Yeah, he's a very seclusive guy. He's still active on some online forums, giving his ideas. He's a smart guy for sure. I mean, he's a genius. I can tell you that much. But yeah, he's very much outside of the public eye, and clearly he likes it that way. I happen to have a friend who, like, his girlfriend went to Singularity University, I believe, or I think they renamed it, and he gives lectures there, or he gave lectures there. So he's still, he's still around, but not really in the cryptocurrency space. And we know very little of him. They always knew very little of him. I think Tim May at one point commented that they didn't even know he was a guy or a girl, or some people suspected that it was a pseudonym for someone, maybe for one of the other cypherpunks, or just people didn't know. And still
Right.
today, yeah, he's a secretive guy.
Well, he was very much inspired by Tim May's Crypto Anarchy.
Yeah, so one of the founding cypherpunks.
So let me put the quote in from that. In a Crypto Anarchy, the government is not temporarily destroyed, but permanently forbidden and permanently unnecessary. I think those last two words are very interesting, the permanently unnecessary.
Yeah, his idea was that governments, states never shrink. They always tend to increase, and same for like rights. They always tend to diminish. You never seem to really get them back, or they never really seem to increase, short of like a full-blown revolution. Um, so to safeguard this stuff through laws and regulations is kind of a slippery slope. Safeguarding it through technology seemed like a much stronger guarantee.
So I liked his quote as well. I'm bringing a lot of quotes into this, but they've written so many profound things. But with B Money, he said, efficient cooperation requires a medium of exchange, money, and a way to enforce contracts. The protocol proposed in this article allows untraceable, pseudonymous entities to cooperate with each other more efficiently by providing them with a medium exchange and a method of enforcing contracts. I hope this is a step towards making crypto anarchy a practical as well as theoretical possibility. So again, it follows those same themes, money, anonymity, but it also this is the point where smart contracts, they start to kind of like raise their head, and it does that with Nick Szabo's BitGold as well.
Yeah, Nick Szabo basically introduced the concept. He invented it. Yeah.
So the structure of Beam Money was, it was. I can see a lot of similarities to Bitcoin when I was reading about it. Ultimately, a distributed ledger.
Yeah, that was one of the key insights in both B Money and BitGold.
And that was a real innovation in the development of digital money.
Yeah, so up until that point, for example, Chang or other digital cash schemes that people were coming up with, there were some ideas on the Cypherpunk mailing list that resembled Chang's idea, but they all relied on this central server that, or a bank or some entity that would keep track of the balances of all participants, of all users. So if Alice pays Bob 1 coin, then that central entity would update the ledger and subtract 1 coin from Alice's balance and add it to Bob's balance. And then B Money and BitGold, they really kind of turned this on its head and said, no, all participants are going to have the ledger, and they're all going to update their ledger every time a transaction is made. So that was definitely a big insight, and also a big step towards Bitcoin.
And so decentralization is something you'll hear a lot about with regards to Bitcoin. If you're coming in and, there's a lot of other projects that people might hear about and they might be interested in, but Bitcoin has such a focus on decentralization. Why is this so important?
I would say it's important because if you have a central entity doing this kind of stuff, then that central entity can mess with it as well. That central entity can block transactions. It can maybe even like freeze balances, or even change balances. Maybe change its own balance. Like, it can mess with it in all sorts of ways. And even if the central entity is totally honest, unless the central entity has a very good way of remaining private, then you can have governments interfering. So you can have governments stepping in and telling the central entity, you know what, we don't really like that whole WikiLeaks organization. We want you to block all payments to it. So by decentralizing this, you sidestep this problem. There's no central entity that can cheat. There's no central entity that can be pressured into obedience.
So it's a step now beyond privacy. Where David Chang was working on privacy, this step beyond is actually to create an economic system that can't be censored and can't be switched off.
I think that's fair to say, yes.
Yeah. So what went wrong with B Money? Why didn't it end up? Because it didn't actually end up being developed. It was a proposal.
Yeah, it was a proposal, and I would say it was kind of a rough proposal as well. There was still kind of some hand waving going on how it should exactly work. How should coins come into circulation? That was a big question. If you start from scratch, then who's gonna get the coins or why? Another problem was, how do you prevent double spending? So if Alice sends the same coin to both Bob and Carol, and she does it at exact same time, and she sends the same transaction, the same coin, to different parts of the network, then you get a divide over the network on which is the true state of balances, and that was a hard problem to solve. It would have been solved in a sort of hypothetical situation where everyone sees every transaction instantly, but that's not the reality of networks. It takes a time for a transaction to sort of make it way through the network, so you get this problem. So that wasn't really solved. One way to kind of solve it, but it was a bit hand wavy, but you could have sort of different tiers of users, where you had sort of a client server kind of system where there was a group of sort of upper tier servers that would maintain the balance, and then you check with a subset of the servers, but there's no guarantee that the servers will agree. There's also no guarantee that the servers won't collude against you. There's sort of like these loose ends in the proposal that just weren't perfectly solved. Even though it was a very clever idea, there were unsolved problems, and he knew that, like he admitted that, but it was still worth publishing and getting people to think about a money system that would work like this. But it wasn't a finished system. It couldn't have worked as he proposed it.
So one of the really interesting things that I find with B Money is that his original vision was essentially a stable coin.
Yeah, in a way, yes. But that's difficult as well.
Of course. But then I looked to his quote regarding Bitcoin that I found very interesting. He said, "I would consider Bitcoin to have failed with regards to its monetary policy because the policy causes high price volatility, which imposes a heavy cost on its users who have to either take undesirable risks or engage in a costly hedging in order to use its currency." And, I've done nearly 200 interviews now, Aaron, and I've also met people who are actually using Bitcoin, and volatility is a constant problem that is raised, and there are people who are either accepting the risk or they are looking at ways to hedge. So he did identify and I know some will argue it's not a flaw, but he did identify a debatable flaw within Bitcoin.
Yeah, and it's interesting that he saw that as a big flaw too, like not just for Bitcoin, but even like for cryptocurrency in general. So in a way, he kind of took a very maximalist approach, interestingly, where he said something like Bitcoin only has one chance to succeed, basically. Like if Bitcoin has taken up the niche of cryptocurrency, and it's very hard to surpass it now. And since it's flawed, it will always be a marginal thing. So since Bitcoin can't be overtaken and it will remain a marginal thing, now cryptocurrency is forever doomed to be a marginal thing.
Well, so this is where I think Bitcold and Nick Szabo is a little bit more interesting. This is where I think it takes it the step further, because Nick's view was actually it was more gold than it was money. And I know gold can be money, but if we think of money as like the medium exchange and gold as more of a store of value, and I know they both can overlap and interchange, but he saw Bitgold more to act like digital gold and accepted the volatility.
I think Szabo, he had a brilliant insight in many ways. There's of course the whole Austrian economics tradition and the whole Goldbach kind of tradition, and I think Szabo kind of agreed with a lot of the arguments, but where typical Goldbachs just sort of assumed that gold was the real money and gold was the way to go, Szabo in a way took a step further and he started to think, okay, but why is gold the way to go? Why is gold such a good money? And then he started to think about, okay, what are the properties that make gold such good money? And these are properties like it's very secure, it's easy to validate, and an incredibly important one is the unforgettable costliness. And this is something you touched on before. Like you can't just create gold, you can't just create more gold. You actually have to dig it out of the ground. You have to actually get it from somewhere in fast energy to get the gold out of the ground. And this unforgettable costliness is what Zaba wanted to translate into something digital. So he wanted to make a digital money that had this unforgeable costliness. That was that's what we talk about today when we talk about stock to flow. This is like his insight in many ways. He explained it in what's the name of the paper? Shelling Out.
Yes.
Shelling Out is, I think, a seminal paper that people should read, and it will really make them think about money in a way that Bitcoin starts making sense.
Yeah, so I covered that in the last episode with Parker, where we talked about money. We talked about how money has changed, and lots of different things have been money, which Nick talks about, whether it's the Yap stones or it's shells, or it then becomes metals. Trying to help people understand that if you forget about a physical versus non-physical, if you can abstract yourself away from thinking money has to be something to produced by the government and has to exist in notes. If you just think based purely on the properties of this, I think it's 6 different properties there are. If you actually look at Bitcoin is the evolution from gold and fiat money, because it solves a couple of the problems in that it's essentially gold that you can transfer over the internet.
Exactly. And one property that I didn't mention is, of course, that all of these properties need to be there without the need for a trusted third party.
Because a Nick's quote, trusted third parties are security holes.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's you were about to say
it. I was, yeah.
So, were there any other innovations in BitGold?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in a way, it was kind of a precursor of a blockchain in a way. So I'll explain that very shortly. So he embraced this idea of proof of work as a way to creating new money. And in his system, the way proof of work would work is that you'd have a candidate string, which is just a random number. And then you'd have to use that to create a valid proof of work. So you'd have to, what we explained, you had to make a bunch of hashes, invest a bunch of energy until you find a valid follow-up proof of work on that candidate string. This would give a new candidate string for others to hash on. So, and then they would have to use that candidate string and they'd hash and hash and hash, invest energy until they would find a valid hash. So then that would be the new candidate string. So then you got a string of candidate strings, basically. You got a string of hashes. And, that's almost what a blockchain is.
So what happened with BitGold? Because Nick wanted to build it, right? He requested for people to help, and he never actually got around to building it.
Yeah, he requested people to help it as late as 2008. He posted on his blog like he wants to actually implement it, and no one responded publicly. Maybe someone responded privately, we don't know, and maybe someone privately had some extra ideas. We don't know that, but no one responded publicly. Let's keep it at that.
All right, cool. So from that, we then get Bitcoin. So we don't need to go into this too much because I'm going to touch on that in the next episode. But yeah,
yep.
October 31st, I'm in Las Vegas. It's my birthday. So my birthday is white paper day. The white paper comes out. I don't see it. I didn't see it until years later. But a white paper drops for what Bitcoin is from Satoshi Nakamoto. So still, at that point, this was just another proposal, just like Beanie Money was, just like BitGold was.
And like many others were. Yeah. By the way, at that point, the Cypherpunk mailing list, of course, didn't exist anymore. So it was posted to the Cryptography mailing list, which was kind of the unofficial successor of the Cypherpunk mailing list. Yes.
So did you look much into the reception of the white paper at the time?
I did look at it. It's been a while, but yeah, I read the thread.
And then I guess 3 months later, we get the code drop.
Yeah. Yeah, there wasn't much enthusiasm for it on the email list at first, except from Halvini. Halvini, we haven't really discussed yet, but he also had his own digital currency project called RPAO, which I think I mentioned it. He published that in 2005. Yeah, he was one of the few, if not the only, really positive recipient of the proposal. And then, yeah, a couple of months later, there was the code.
And we're here 11 years later, so we can say this is the most successful project. It looks like it will last. I mean, it has, always will have threats. So what is it that you...
I'll know one thing that I think is interesting. What happened between the white paper and the code drop, which is that for some reason the 21 million limits was implemented there. It wasn't really explained why. I think it wasn't in the white paper. It wasn't discussed on the mailing list. It was just a new thing that was in the code, and I think that was a very important insight because, and I kind of suspect personally that Halvini may have told Satoshi to do this because by giving it this 21 million limit, there was actually a reason for people to speculate on future value, to actually buy it, to actually want to hold it. And by people speculating on future value and wanting to hold it, that gives incentive for miners to actually mine it. Shall I read you one quote from Halvini?
Yes.
All right, I'm gonna read you one quote for Halvini, and that's why I part of me suspects that this may have been his contribution to Bitcoin. So he wrote, and I think this was after Bitcoin launch. He wrote, "As an amusing thought experiment, imagine that Bitcoin is successful and becomes the dominant payment system in use throughout the world. Then the total value of the currency should be equal to the total value of all the wealth in the world. Current estimates of the total worldwide household wealth that I have found range from 100 trillion to 300 trillion. With 20 million coins, that gives each coin a value of about 10 million. So the possibility of generating coins today with a few cents of compute time may be quite a good bet, with a payoff of something like 100 million to 1. Even if the odds of Bitcoin succeeding to this degree are slim, are they really 100 million to 1 against? Something to think about." So there you see, like this 21 million limit gives sort of a game theoretical reason for people to actually want to buy it and mine it and invest in it. And I think that was actually a pretty crucial idea.
And there are people who will say volatility, you have to have volatility. You can't go from something from zero to worth trillions without volatility. And another thing I'll just drop in is stuck with me that Dan Held said. He puts in that the 4-year halvening creates a marketing hype cycle. And with that helps grow the network.
Yeah. But like Vaidai said, maybe it's actually a very bad idea. And Nick Szabo wasn't sure either. He said in one of his posts, I think in 2011 or 2013, that he's not sure if the 21 million limit is a good idea. But we can say that at least it works. At least we have something that's working today.
Yeah. So were there any other innovations within Bitcoin and the white paper that really stood out that made it work?
Oh yeah, I mean the clever insight was of course to combine the proof of work system with a consensus system. So these were kind of the two aspects that, for example, why I was struggling with, like how do you get the coins into circulation, and also if there's a dispute on the state of the ledger, then who gets his way, like which one is the real ledger. So Bitcoin brilliantly combined these things by having new coins come into circulation through proof of work, but not as the proof of works themselves, but through a distribution mechanism. The proof of work just works as a lottery to decide who gets the new coins, and at the same time, the longest chain determines which is the true state of the ledger. So two big problems were brilliantly solved with one stone.
Amazing. Okay, well, look, this has been fantastic, really useful. I'm going to share all your articles in the show notes if people want to read up more. Are there any other parts of history that are missing here that you want to raise before we close out?
I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot of Austrian economics, of course, that I think led up to Bitcoin. I think Hayek did the denationalization of money was a very important work. Although Hayek's idea was closer to Vaidai's idea in the sense of that currency needs to be stable. He expected the market to pick a stable currency. But it's interesting that the denationalization of money was published in 1976, which was also the year that Diffie and Hellman published their white paper on public key cryptography. So in a way, I kind of see that as the birth year of Bitcoin, like these two ideas published in the same year.
Well, it's a fascinating bit of history. It's fascinating to look back. I really appreciate the work that you did for this. I really think it was very helpful to me. It was very helpful to me to read them all in one go and kind of piece it all together. You said you're going to do some more work on this, which is great. I'll look forward to it. But yeah, I really appreciate this. Just before we close out, if people want to follow your work, Aaron, where can they find you?
So I'm on Twitter, Aaron van W. If you speak Dutch, I have my own podcast with two friends, which is the Bitcoin Show. So you can find that on YouTube. And of course, Bitcoin Magazine. Still write for Bitcoin Magazine.
Well, listen, thanks for doing this. I'll let everyone know you've come and done this very last minute. It's a bit late for both of us are. So look, I appreciate your help here. I owe you one now. So ever need anything from me, you let me know.
All right. Thanks for having me, Peter.
Thank you. Okay, so what did you make of that one? Did you enjoy that show? Have you listened to the other two parts of the Bitcoin Beginner's Guide? If you haven't, definitely go and check them out. Also, keep an eye on the future shows coming. I'm going to be running this for I think it's going to be going for about the next 6 weeks. So, while I've read all of Aaron's Genesis Files articles before, this was the first time that I'd read them all together, and it really highlighted to me the evolution of digital money. Learning about the cypherpunks and what they stood for also helped me understand why such people as Matt Odell keep on about the importance of Bitcoin privacy. These people were so ahead of their time, and the stuff they were fighting for, even in the 90s, like privacy online and data protection, are still things people are working on today. They were looking at this before the internet had become what it was, before we had our mobile phones, before everything had happened with Edward Snowden and all the data thefts. They were looking at it then. The cypherpunks would also be credited with so many other achievements. Julian Assange's WikiLeaks, PGP, Tor, and of course Bitcoin. It was also great to hear about all the work that went into some of the precursors to Bitcoin, like B-Money and Bitcold, before Satoshi pieced it all together and came up with Bitcoin. So that is the prehistory of Bitcoin done. It could be a lot more in depth. I think in the future I might even do a whole series on itself because it really, really is fascinating. Anyway, on Tuesday I will be back and I'll have part 4 where I'll be looking at what Bitcoin is with Dan Held. And if you've got any questions about this, do feel free to hit me up. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. And listen, if you're enjoying this series, if you want to support the show, there's so many things you can do. You can leave me a review on iTunes. You become a patron. You can become a sponsor. They all help me keep the show going. Just head over to my website, it's whatbitcoindid.com, click on the support section, that will explain everything. Anyway, I hope you have a great weekend. If you've got any questions, as I said, feel free to hit me up. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com.